Good afternoon, and welcome to Tuesday Explorers, a series of lifelong learning opportunities brought to you by AARP Virginia. I'm Suba Sadi, an AARP Volunteer Community Ambassador with AARP Virginia here in Fairfax Station, Virginia. AARP is here to make your voice heard and provide information and resources on the issues that matter, and to connect you with fun learning opportunities. We provide valuable educational, informational, and fun resources, things like webinars, teletown halls, discounts, and more. When it's safe to host in-person events, you'll be invited to attend. In the meantime, AARP will continue to offer programs virtually. We will have time today for Q&A at the end of Pam's presentation, so please submit your comments and questions in the chat box or, of course, in the Q&A. I'd like to thank my co-host and helper today, Trudy Marotta. Like me, Trudy, that you've heard her voice already, is a volunteer community ambassador with AARP Virginia. She will be monitoring the chat box and the Q&A box. Well, on to our program. It is sincerely my pleasure to introduce and welcome our guest speaker, Pam Cressey. Pamela Cressey was the Alexandria City archaeologist for 35 years and has been an adjunct member of the George Washington University Anthropology and American Studies departments since the 1970s. She received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Iowa. She lives in Mason Neck, where she volunteers for Mason Neck State Park, the Lorton Community Food Action Center Food Pantry, and tutors students to expand literacy. Today, Pamela Cressey discusses her 35 years of rediscovering African-American sites through her lens of community archaeology. You are in for a real treat. So please give a warm virtual welcome to Pam. And Pam, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Suba. This is wonderful. I'm used to seeing Suba at the food pantry while we're serving people, and it's a treat to be here with all of you. Thanks for joining us today and coming in even from the West Coast, where I'm originally from. Today, part of my talk is titled Conscience, and Community. And I'm very delighted and privileged to give you this talk today because it's a personal story of this journey that I've had over the decades with Alexandrians and with visitors to Alexandria, my colleagues, and many, many volunteers and students as we've worked together to rediscover and find all of Alexandria's past, whether it's been known or unknown. But generally in archaeology, things really aren't known the way they are until we find the places, the objects, understand the stories that have been told, and actually even rediscover written records that no one has considered looking at for decades or oftentimes hundreds of years. This is a personal story, and I have developed this story in many ways during this last year that we've all gone through. Certainly, we all had to go through some degree of consciousness and the sense of having a conscience during COVID. And I spent the year plus primarily alone and with my cats and with some very good neighbors and friends, upon occasion socially distanced, but also doing telephone yoga, which is very different than goat yoga, but the good news is nobody can see you do it. So today, I want to tell you this perspective of mine on how I witnessed and participated in this journey to rediscover and tell the story of African-American history in Alexandria. It's just my perspective. I'm sure there are many others, as in all memories, but it is my memory put into a perspective of my own past, of how I was raised and my background, what my values were, what my intentions were as a public archaeologist, and then as seen through, as Suba said, a different lens, sort of a reframing in this second decade, almost now the third of this 21st century. Certainly in 1977, I didn't know or think of the term of historical justice, but I would like to take you on this path and how it has projected me through. Here's the city of Alexandria in the 1850s. And actually, I'd like to know how many of you have ever visited here. Several of the buildings that you see in this bird's eye view actually are still standing. This is Washington Street. And if you came in from National Airport, you would be coming right down the street you see there on the right with the horses. You would be driving down that same street with many of those same buildings. So please jump in to say whether you visited there or not. And you see the Potomac River over there on the left. Alexandria was a tobacco trading port, a very early one in Alexandria, starting back in the 1730s. And it became a part of the original District of Columbia when it was laid out and surveyed. It later rejected its combination with the nation's capital and returned to Alexandria right before the Civil War, or about a decade before the Civil War. So this is Alexandria. And as I came into Alexandria in 1977, there was a giant sign as we came in, a huge billboard. And what it said is that Alexandria was the most historic community in America, which I thought that was a little overstated, but I was happy to have, as city archaeologist, I was really happy to have that attitude. We are historic and we're going to do something about it. But all the sites that were listed were related to George Washington in one way or another, Robert E. Lee. And as I drove in on Washington Street, I did see a large commemoration of a Confederate soldier. By looking at the names of the streets over Alexandria, eventually about 14 square miles, I could see how the citizens' identity and perspectives had shifted over the centuries to reflect the actual identity of the city as a part of the founding of America with George Washington, the leaving of the nation's capital, as well as leaving the United States of America and fighting primarily on the side of the Confederacy, and this great pride in very early history of Alexandria. So today, I'd like to take you on this journey through these areas of Alexandria that we explored, also looking, as my intention was, as all archaeologists are always doing, to discover what we don't know and to find, even in an urban environment, the very precious remains, or perhaps even standing structures that were not identified as African American. Well, I came here, I was born in Southern California in Los Angeles, and actually both sets of my grandparents were immigrants to Southern California, one from Iowa due to the Depression, one from England for reasons that were still not clear, but for some sort of new start. And both of the families wanted a new start. Only a very few objects came with us and a few stories. But in each case, there was a great sense of remembrance and of the stories of hard work and dedication, and kind of a sense that these very few objects had great value. They were displayed on our dining room hutch, and I was just mesmerized, almost as if it was a personal museum. My mom and my dad were very careful to train me in their values, as most parents are, and to also tell me the stories related to these very few objects. We didn't use them. They weren't a part of daily life. They were really seen as like kind of special objects. And my grandparents on my father's side, the Cresseys, would send me small things like a thimble or a locket with in a box with a very small story attached to it. And I kept all the boxes and all the stories in a little drawer that I would pull out and look at. I'm sorry. I think what's happened is it would not move forward. Let me present this. I think we should be okay. My mother was a very patient woman, and her major issues related to being good to people, hospitality, kindness, fairness. And my father had great concerns about just doing the best that you can, and really kind of learning from the school of hard knocks. Here's my dad and I while I was in college. And I really want to acknowledge my dad for his messages that continue to echo through my ears. For one, he was very concerned that I would go to college, that I would feel too much of a smarty pants, I guess he would say. He said, if you go to college, don't feel that you're better than other people. And he reminded me that in fact, I was privileged. He actually used that word, that's my memory, to be able to have a nuclear family, a dad that worked for the telephone company, and an ability to save to be able to go to college. And he said, you must make something of your college education. You must return it. You must kind of pass it on. Do something right with that education. That, along with President Kennedy saying, what am I going to do for my country, before he was assassinated while I was in high school. These became very seminal elements of my life. My father was a great advocate of affirmative action, of civil rights, and of fairness. And we had political discussions over the table, so that I understood how to look at information and look critically at newspapers and look at what was happening at the day. So as I looked at Alexandria, as I came here, I saw that we knew something about George Washington, never as much as we can know. And actually very little was actually known or talked about Robert E. Lee, although there were 2 buildings that you could go to related to the Lee family, much more to learn about them. But actually very little was written or said about African-American history. African-Americans were about 30% of the population throughout Alexandria's past. And I could tell by looking at census records that even before 1790, every African-American living in town was enslaved. And at 1790, there were only 52 people of all ages who were free legally. To me, this was a story to find, many stories to find, to tell. And that was about what I thought as a traditional archaeologist. How can I find things? How can I explore them? How can I tell the stories, share them? That was my thinking at the time. And it was very traditional. Let's find the site, let's dig it, let's save the artifacts, create collections, let's display them, and let's give talks. And it's still a very powerful way to share archaeology, because in fact, most people think things that come out of the ground are a great surprise, a great gift, and we want to understand how they got there, and the mystery in some ways solved about who actually put them there and what their stories are. But I wanted to see what is beyond the story that had been told at the time as opportunity presented itself. And as I thought last year about my goals, as I came to tell the stories of people and find those stories under asphalt in many cases, I became aware of what Alexandrians taught me and the gratitude that I felt for the city of Alexandria for employment and for support and for interest and moving forward in African-American and all archaeology and history, but also thinking about how did all of this happen in Alexandria? As I witnessed it, as I got to be a small participant in this journey of historical justice, I wondered to myself, how in fact did this come about? Because I just was a part of different sites and different people. And I thought, you know, what I need to do is think about this and figure out how I can express gratitude for people. And as I thought about it, I saw that the idea of being conscious and the idea of having a conscience actually fit together. So what is conscious? Well, just the definition says it's awake, it's aware, it's to realize, it's to know, it's to understand, and it's actually internal to us. Each individual becomes conscious of something. We know that. We wake up in the morning, we become aware of things, or we go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that. Conscience is an internal awareness of our own actions. It's a different type of consciousness. It's an internal consciousness that we know right from wrong. We have a moral sense. We have a sense of fairness and justice. We have an obligation to do the right thing. And we may have a sense of guilt or remorse or wrong if we or the group that we're a part of did something that we need to feel that there was a wrong in some way perpetrated. In this case, the individual has this conscience, but it's based on a collective moral standards. What do we actually are taught and believe as a community, as a culture? And that interested me because I really saw that Alexandrians, through individual action, moving towards more collective action, became a part of understanding this. And that the Alexandrian has taught me far more about how to do actually community archaeology, that there is power through people's memories, those living today, as well as the memories of those who lived before us. There's power in places, that there's tremendous power in morality that we do carry. And this idea in our society that there really is equity, or should be, a power of individual's vision, of a basic person reading the newspaper, and then coupling that with the power of opportunity. When might there be a chance to do something? And so we see this individual action turn into collective action, partnerships that we would have never imagined, with unexpected results, so that the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts. In other words, what Alexandrians have created through collective action is so much greater than what would an individual would have dreamed or thought about or actually written a plan for, and far more than anybody would have ever considered funding. How would you ever figured it out? And what all of this has resulted in is the idea of, to me, Alexandrians, community archaeology, community history, where places of remembrance, places of conscience have been saved. And one of the groups I want to acknowledge as a part of this process has been the Alexandria Archaeological Commission, the first and one of the few still extant in America. And the Archaeological Commission back in the late 1970s and early 1980s developed mission statements and plans and continued to upgrade those over time. But the basic tenets were that the goal was to study all peoples and all time periods. Don't be stingy, don't say just one time period. Let's share with everyone, regardless of who they are or where they come from, and let's save places and repurpose them. Now that was shocking to me. I really couldn't believe, as an archaeologist, as a digger, essentially, that you're going to save a place when in fact you were often excavating before there was going to be destruction and redevelopment of the site, or even maybe before erosion, and repurposing it. Geez, how could I, as an archaeologist, have the means to actually do that? I couldn't believe it. But the Archaeological Commission members actually believe that. And as a part of this, I was hired initially to excavate the courthouse site, which was almost a city block on the 500 block of King Street. Starbucks is there now, and the courthouse. And in that excavation, by putting out one little kind of article one little paragraph in the local newspaper asking for volunteers. 150 people called or stopped in the first week and said, we want to come help dig in this parking lot that was covered with asphalt. We really care about this past. That was overwhelming to me too. So how is an archaeologist to operate when we're actually normally quite private people? We dig, we take our artifacts, we analyze them, we wash them, we care for them. Where is this going? And the volunteers taught me that all this dramatic research could come out of census records, tax records, and we could find the first enslaved household in Alexandria, actually an individual household headed by a woman who was enslaved to the person who she lived next to, and she was raising her children there. And also by looking at the census, I could see that free Blacks were beginning to increase in Alexandria, that this would not need to be only a story of slavery, but maybe there are questions relating to freedom here, because we saw that there were 52 free Blacks in 1790, a whole lot more than zero. But then in 20 years, there was a 600% increase. Why did people come to Alexandria? What did they find here? Even within, as Alexandria is a part of the District of Columbia, what were they looking for, and how did they fare? So we asked certain questions. Where were the free Blacks? How could we find them? There's asphalt, there's sidewalks, there's streets, there's built homes. Where were they? How did they gain their freedom? And what is this paradox of free Blacks in a slave city? And not just a slave city, but one that had major slave dealers. So we embarked upon a process of finding African-American free sites. And we can be very thankful to the tax collectors in Alexandria. So when you're paying your taxes, be really happy that this information is being collected and perhaps kept, because we were able to find where people of color, they were noted as COL, were living either as renters or in some cases actually owners of properties. And this brought us to the area of the Alfred Street Baptist Church on Alfred Street that was called the Bottoms, and we found that name by referring to doing oral histories. And this was the earliest free Black neighborhood. This is housing that was constructed here after we dug, but we got there after the earlier historic homes were already torn down. And we were able to begin to do some excavation to ask about what life was like for the very earliest free Blacks in the early 19th century, and even going back into the 18th century. It was while we were digging here that we got the awareness of the Alfred Street Baptist Church that you see here still standing, dating to the 1850s. But by going through deed research, we saw that the first Baptist colored church was in the same location, a wooden structure, and that in fact, this was the oldest Black congregation in town. So what made this neighborhood so special that many African Americans lived there, and we saw them gain themselves by themselves out of slavery through the work of their own hands, by their relatives out of slavery, in some cases other people, and then free them, as well as purchase properties or have long-term ground rents, and then actually develop this church. Well, one of the major ingredients in this and another neighborhood was ownership of the land by Quakers, who specifically helped free people and then provided the opportunity for them to rent or in some cases purchase. And it was at this site that Mr. Harry Burke came running up to me as we were digging and said, "Come and get into my car." Now, I would not do that today if an unknown man ran up to me and said, "Come get in my car." But I guess some things have changed. And so in 1979, I did that because what he said is, "I hear you're interested in Black history." And it was out on the grapevine that we were starting to do this historical research. And I said, yes. He said, well, get in the car. I have someplace to show you. And he took me over to the Robinson African-American Library, established in 1940. I didn't know it was there. And at the time, it was a derelict building. In this case, this is its newer renovation. But at the time, it was almost derelict, would have been torn down shortly. And he said, we're trying to save the Alfred Street Baptist Church, which I just showed you. And we're also trying to save our Black library that we all went to when we were kids, going to the segregated Black high school, Parker Gray. And so he asked me to put artifacts in here, and we began the very first exhibits and some of the very earliest oral histories based upon Mr. Burke, Miss Annie B. Rose, and Mr. Roger Anderson, as well as Richard Bierce, who was the Director of Historic Resources for City of Alexandria at the time. And all of these efforts led to eventually an opportunity. The Black high school, which had only been desegregated little more than a decade after I had arrived in Alexandria, and everyone was going to what was then called T.C. Williams High School, is now Alexandria High School, that it was going to be sold by the city, and the newly formed Society for the Preservation of Black Heritage wanted some of the funds from that school to be used to develop a Black History Resource Center and Museum. And this is ultimately what happened. The Black History Museum was formed and became a part of the City of Alexandria and the Office of Historic Alexandria. And here you see it on the left, the two gables buildings with the L in between. And you can see that the idea of actually commemorating and remembering Black history came about through the efforts of the Black Preservation Society. Also, another thing that Mr. Burke and others taught me, beyond the fact that you can dream big and look for opportunity to advocate for your cause, is it's very important to mark, to plaque, to memorialize things. Well, why was this called Robinson Library? It was named after an African-American minister of the second oldest Black church in town. But it was also, this plaque was to commemorate the first civil rights action, a sit-in that people living in the 20th century remembered. And that took us to knowledge at the current Barrett Library that their first African-American sit-in was in 1939. This information really led us to understand that this library was more than a place to go get books today, and actually was a Quaker cemetery before it was a library. And in another reason, we were able to identify Quaker burials before the city library was expanded, and gave us much more information and connection with the Alexandria meeting. Also, through the Black Preservation Society's efforts and the Office of Historic Alexandria, a plaque was put at the Barrett Library to commemorate the sit-in. Again, people who had gone, who remembered 1939, were able to say, this happened. Let's not forget about it. Let's put up a sign. Let's get it out there in the public consciousness out of just individual memories. As a part of this research project, we also looked at another neighborhood that came up through the tax rolls of many, many African Americans living next door to each other in housing that they built that was land once owned by a Quaker family. And by oral history and through even corroboration through some written sources, we found that this neighborhood was called Hayti, not based upon the fact that people came from the island of Haiti, but rather that the island of Haiti was the location of the first successful African Black civil rights effort to free themselves and in what became the island of Haiti. And Toussaint Louverture was considered a really important heroic individual as George Washington was seen for America. So there were other neighborhoods we found over time in Durham, North Carolina, and I think in Pittsburgh, many other places that are called Hayti. And so when we went there, when we saw the tax register, then we went the street, well, it just looked like any other town in Old Town. How are you supposed to tell this is Black history, or is there Black history underneath these fantastic houses? Well, in fact, there was one city block, one block that was empty, undeveloped, underdeveloped. This is what it's now standing there today. And we began a multi-year research project to study where these African Americans lived. And thanks again to a volunteer, Karen Worley, at the time, she did this woodcut for us based upon the archaeological remains, where you can see the pilings that the houses stood on. We could tell the configuration of the houses and probably how many rooms they had because of the way the pilings were situated. We could tell where there were laundry clotheslines, and we know that there were laundresses living there, and marbles and other playthings. So we know that the children recorded in the censuses are there as well as Mr. Brooks' stable, cart, and horse that we know that he had, again, from tax records. We were able to put together daily life of a freed African American in the first half of the 19th century, as well as after the Civil War, and understand the level of independence that they had, that the artifacts showed independent households and interactions with others who had also gained their freedom, and in some cases were buying their family members and finding ways to educate them. Now, this takes us to another site. This is so I'm speaking chronologically, how we're going through into the 1980s. The Alexandria Canal wasn't anything I was interested in. I'm really more interested in people, big things made out of stone, engineering feats. I think they're fascinating, but it really wasn't my calling, I would say. But the Archaeological Commission said, we need to look at this canal. It's under there, it's undoubtedly there. It's in a place that people fish, but there's old cars there. People are putting old tires, oil. It was not a pretty place. And yet it was on the Alexandria waterfront. How is the waterfront going to redevelop and be an amenity for Alexandria? So from bringing awareness to the developer that the Alexandria Canal was located here, and the developer changed the outline of the spatial plan for the development so that the tide lock of the canal that we had rediscovered could be kept. It's underneath what you're looking at, and many of the coping stones used elsewhere as artistic and historic features, but that it actually be saved underwater along with the wooden gates that were there, the wooden floor of the tide lock, that actually this tide lock and other locks join with the Alexandria Canal leading up to the Chesapeake and Ohio, the C&O Canal, over a miraculous aqueduct bridge, a marvel, an engineering marvel of its time, so that Alexandrians could bring goods from the West and take them also to the West to compete with Georgetown. And so this became a major amenity. And that was amazing to me, that the Archaeological Commission, by taking this information to the developer and saying, hey, why don't we keep this? Let's keep this place. And by the way, why don't you pay to excavate it? And then we'll really have this full history. That's the right thing to do. Savage Fogarty, the developers at the time, did that, and actually ended up having a variety of design awards and got so interested in amenities that they included public art as well. As a part of this, Mr. Harry Burke again came to me and said, let's start doing oral history. There's so many African Americans that are of an age that they may not be with us much longer. Let's go talk to Miss Annie Rose. And Miss Virginia Napper. And Miss Virginia Napper worked at the Old Dominion Glass Factory, which was once located here where a hotel sat for many years and now is being redeveloped again. the Preservation Society was able to put up a plaque, which still stands, recognizing that the glass factory was there, and that across the canal, where this canal was, cross canal, there was an African-American community developed after or during and after the Civil War. And from talking to Ms. Snapper, we were able to find out that, in fact, these people had come seeking freedom in Alexandria during and after the Civil War, coming up from more southern parts of Virginia to come into a city that was held during the Civil War by federal troops. And in fact, not only from 1865, the beginning of the war, it was held under military governorship until 1869, many years after the war. And so this was the first historic plaque relating to a Black neighborhood. What we did know in Alexandria were places not just of segregation, like the Robinson Library, that those of us who were new to town learned about, but we learned about the slave pens, the slave jails, the slave dealers that came to Alexandria after they were outlawed in the city of Washington, D.C. And they came to Alexandria to continue advertising in the hinterlands to buy slaves and then bring them into Alexandria for shipment south to Natchez and New Orleans to be put on the auction block, or to walk to the south to be sold once again. This is the domestic slave trade, and is why Alexandria was infamous among people who were anti-slavery and abolitionists. And they came to visit and actually even did a woodcut and continually had petitions in Congress to stop the domestic slave trade. Well, the Bruins slave jail, we knew was there. It was a building. We could tell by looking at insurance records that it was a parking lot of the Table Talk restaurant. It was on what was once the earliest turnpike in Alexandria, going out to the hinterland, a place to be if you are involved in the trade of anything, whether it's cattle that were brought in, drovers, or taking the remains of the cattle and having a tannery or other stables, or in this case, literally stabling humanity for resale. And this is what we looked at in the 1970s and 1980s, that there is a parking lot that could well have information as well as a standing structure. And here is that structure. And we could see that, in fact, there's a lot of history there, and this is an important building. We needed to do historical research and keep our eyes on this site. At the same time, the Archaeological Commission said, we need developers to not just take a voluntary action, but to be participants in the site planning review process in Alexandria, so that when projects come up that have a high impact on important archaeological resources, that they become partners in recovering this history, doing the history, publicizing the history, and possibly even shifting footprints or creating plazas, courts, or art that can commemorate and again bring up to a public consciousness whatever history is missing, not just for African Americans, but for everyone, all time periods, all places and people. And so we also knew that the other slave pen was there, Franklin and Armfield, as it was originally called, a building that looked like many others on Duke Street. And it was because a developer wanted to redevelop it that he agreed to pay a private archaeology firm to do the archaeology. And we received the first historic study, which is on the City of Alexandria Archaeology website, of this slave dealership and what happened within it and its connections with places farther south and auctions. And it is through this developer's conscience and interest, as well as the work of Janice Artemel and the company that she worked for at the time, that this history was done and archaeological work came about. Because of the increased awareness through this work, we were fortunate that the Northern Virginia Urban League got interested in the building, purchased it, and renamed it, rebranded it Freedom House, a place not just of injustice, but a place to acknowledge the value of freedom here, and actually then obtained a historic plaque from the State Preservation Office so that everyone could tell as they went by what this was. It was very important to the Urban League so that people are conscious of what went on in Alexandria, to don't forget it, to be aware of it, and actually then celebrate freedom in this place, the great paradox. And so we decided to also look below the layers of just what is slavery there. And by looking at what happened in this place after the federal troops took over this building, the first day they entered Alexandria in 1861, we saw that the federal troops, the army, created Lovicher Hospital, the first we know of, perhaps one of the very few hospitals created during the Civil War, specifically to focused on non-whites. This would be American Indians as well as African Americans. And by looking at the entire block the slave pen was on, as well as the adjoining block, we could tell, well, there was one building left, the blue one, where the surgeon lived and conducted surgeries. And then the one, and then getting the neighbors involved and the owners of that building, and a new plaque also being put up to commemorate this incredible freedom of Lovicher Hospital. And then archaeological work conducted by my colleagues, Fran Bromberg, Steve Shepard, many volunteers, to actually find where housing was put up, barracks were put up for those that were fleeing Alexandria, the contraband as they were called at the time, and eventually called freedmen. And this is where the diaries and letters of Miss Julia Wilbur became so important, and more research came about. And I want you to definitely think about reading the book by Paula Tarnpole Whitaker about Julia Wilbur and her writings, a woman from New York here during the Civil War, working very, very hard in very bright ways to maintain sanitation, health, and truly a quality of life for the probably 20,000 African Americans who were refugees who fled into and through Alexandria. And how Shiloh Baptist Church was found, actually the minister started preaching at Lovicher Hospital and was founded in 1863, and Shiloh Baptist Church today, as well as the block across the street that Shiloh owns and operates, and its increasing size of its congregation. And all of this, as Shiloh then developed a property for senior housing, allowed us to put many years after this initial research, another historical marker relating to everything that happened on this block, actually from the worst type of slavery where you're being divided and separated from your family and sent south to be put on the auction block, and to actually freedom and service by the US colored troops, who then went on to actually have more civil rights history in Alexandria. So I'd like to leave you in that sort of suspenseful place, I hope, so that you'll join me again for part 2 as we look at how Alexandrians continued this idea of individuals getting very interested and knowledgeable about a place, and then having the passion to push forward, advocate, and develop partnerships that we would have never imagined with developers, designers, artists, educators, how the City Council, the Planning Commission, the Board of Architectural Review, all worked with the Office of Historic Alexandria to create places that actually are now places not just of remembrance, but of conscience. So I want to thank you, and I hope to see you again next week.
Pam, that was fantastic. This is Trudy, and I'm the one that's going to handle the questions and answers for you. I'm going to start with the last question first, because the individual asked if you could repeat the name of the book that you just referenced. And it was about the same time that the Shiloh Baptist Church slide came up. Can you repeat the name of the book and the author?
Yes, I can move forward here. I know, Amber, you've already developed, you've taken this bibliography, I believe, and it's going to make it available. But let me show it to you. What I just mentioned is the fourth reference here, Paula Tarnopol Whitaker's book, A Civil Life in Uncivil Time, Julia Wilbur's Struggle for Purpose. Really an interesting book, and a great book also to understand the life of being enslaved is look at Harriet Jacobs' book, Incidences in the Life of a Slave Girl. It's edited by Jean Fagan Yellen, and she's also written some other books or edited them about Ms. Jacobs, who actually came to Alexandria also at the same time of Julia Wilbur, in this case, specifically to educate the contraband and freedmen.
Very good, thank you. The first question that we had was, whoops, I can't get back. Oh, I've got it over here. The year that the Alfred Street Baptist Church was built.
That church, I'd have to go back and look again. I think that church went in the 1850s or possibly even later, post-Civil War. I actually didn't pull that fact. There's a wonderful book. This was only a one-page bibliography. I think you can Google the history of the Alfred Street Baptist Church. The congregation put out a wonderful oversized book on the history of the church, and you'll see the history of the building that was put in. The earlier wood structure goes back to pretty close to the land, I think was for sure there, deeded out to it by 1810 when the Quaker merchant died.
Okay, which leads to my next question. How did the Quakers come to be involved in Alexandria?
Oh, that's a great story. And you can also look on the City of Alexandria website for under the bibliography of Alexandria archaeology relating to the Quaker burial ground. There's quite a bit of Quaker history in there. As I understand it, Quakers moved into Alexandria primarily from Pennsylvania in the 18th century for good economic opportunity. Some people have, when I've been asked about this, have thought Quakers are like the Amish. They want to keep in older technology. That's not the case. Quakers were really on cutting edge technology. They were very strong in business. They ran much of the dry goods. They were merchants. They had wharves, ships. And as a part of their religious practice and moral code, they had to be definitely debt free. In fact, you got kicked out if they thought you were not just playing around too much, but didn't handle your money right. But they also outlawed slavery. And even in other parts of Virginia, people gave up their slaves, set them free, if not before, or usually in the 18th century or beginning of the 19th century. And so we know from letters of Edward Stabler, who owned an apothecary shop, and our other research on other Quaker sites, that they were instrumental in freeing people. They would buy people. So when we saw that all the buying and selling of people is in the Alexandria deed books, just like pieces of land. And we saw Quakers buying people, African Americans, and we said, well, how could they do this? They wouldn't be Quakers if they did that. Well, we found out they in fact freed them, or in one case, I think, sent them to Maryland to run an errand and forgot to ask them to come back. But they were big believers in education and justice.
Interesting, very good. Next question is, what streets make up the Hayti neighborhood?
Great. Okay, that's got to be from somebody local. So, hi. South Royal Street, the 400 block of South Royal Street was kind of the focus of Hayti, both sides of the street. And we're also a little some on the 300 block, but more on the 600 block. But if you go over one block east to Fairfax Street or Royal Street, that was predominantly white, but free blacks might be living in those houses doing service, but they actually had a free status. But the people on South Royal Street, the 400 block, were free legally.
And my next question is the Freedom House currently open?
I couldn't say today. The city of Alexandria has purchased Freedom House and is creating plans for how the public will enter. In the last several years, it's been open only at certain times of the year. But the city of Alexandria, its residents have taken very strong action. Its legislators have worked hard through the governor's office and the state legislature for funding so that the city can purchase it and keep this remembrance going.
Very good. I'm looking to see, I see there are a couple of people who have their hands raised. I do want to acknowledge that I see that. And I'm wondering, while I'm asking this next question, if you could type your question into either the Q&A section or the chat room, that would help us as well. The next, Suba, are we okay on time?
Yeah, I just want to say we did have a person, Benjamin Skolnick, who said it's currently closed to the public. We're in the middle of a renovation of the building and the exhibit. It'll open again, so keep your ears open for an announcement.
Thanks, Ben. That's great to hear.
Thank you. The next question I have is, what role did Alexandria or Alexandrians have, if any, in the Underground Railroad?
Great question. I was not able to discern that. I heard stories, but I was never able to follow up on anything actually occurring. There is one story relating to the Quakers that comes from a source like from the 1920s or 30s, but the reference had no source. So about the idea that people did come up here, there were conductors that sent them on. It makes sense. I have read historical works done in the 1960s, talked about a standard place that people would run to would be ports to try and get on ships and get away. But I know that we had this free Black population in town, and there was a lot of understanding that people are helping people, even if we don't have a specific story, keeping them safe, helping them get away. We have so many runaway ads in the local Alexandria Gazette, and those have been also referenced and analyzed to understand who the runaways are, their ages, and even how they looked. Tremendous understanding, and their talents and abilities, musical, their abilities as artisans or readers or writers or singers. So I think it's fair to say that there was some action going on, but I'm not aware of a specific place or person.
Very good. Is there a brochure or a website that would direct them to walking tours of this area that you've discussed?
Yes, and I think I have it here. I'm just looking. I didn't review this bibliography thing today because it wasn't going to be in here, but I thought I had, yeah. So what you want to do here is look at Google Courageous Journey, Alexandria's Black History Driving Tour. And that is a current web link that you can go to. That's a part of the Office of Historic Alexandria. There is also, I believe, still a PDF of the original Courageous Journey brochure. Ben, you can let me know if that's right or not. The original Courageous Journey brochure has more places than the driving tour itself.
Very good. It looks like I missed one question earlier. I had to scroll back up. Has anyone dug up the parking lot at the Tabletop Restaurant, or is there a plan to do that if they ever resurface the parking lot?
Oh, well, whenever anybody says, what site are you always waiting for? Because this, again, this is opportunistic in urban archaeology. You just don't show up with your backhoe in somebody's backyard and say, I want to dig here. I don't know. I would think at some point it might come about. It's certainly, I think, ripe. That parking lot's been there for a long time. There are depressions that I've seen for decades where there's probably brick lined wells or privies. That doesn't mean you should run out there with your shovel today. But we're really happy Table Talk is still going strong because it's a great place to eat. But more about the Bruin site next week. So you'll have to stay tuned next week to learn more about all the work that has been done there.
Okay, very good. And I see that we are coming up at the top of the hour. So I'm afraid that's all the time we're going to have for questions today. Suba, I will turn the program back over to you. Thank you, Pam.
Thank you. Hey, Pam, before I start in my closing comments, Deacon Willis did say that in the chat that the church was built in 1855.
Oh, good. 1850s. I'm glad I remembered. Thank you so much. The memory is not totally going.
Yeah, and Amber is putting in a lot of great websites for everybody. I did see one other chat. Are there volunteer opportunities available anywhere that you could plug as far as somebody wants to volunteer to assist, Pam?
Well, of course, I'm retired, I can say. That's why I'm here at AARP supporting the cause. Yeah, I want to direct you to the Office of Historic Alexandria and Alexandria Archaeology, and even Fairfax Archaeology, and other places. Alexandria was very early to have a city archaeologist, and I hope you can visit the Archaeology Museum and the Torpedo Factory Art Center. Eleanor Breen and all the staff there. It will depend always on needs, priorities, and as you know, I think many of you know, a lot of ships were found in waterfront excavations in the last few years. So I know they have a lot of work to do on preserving and studying those ships and those artifacts. So please contact them. Again, you can just Google on the City of Alexandria website, Alexandria Archaeology, and I'm sure they'll be happy to talk to you.
All right. Thanks, Pam. Well, folks, we got to move on. It's coming up at 4 o'clock hour Eastern Standard Time. But on behalf of AARP Virginia, I'd like to again thank our great guest speaker for today, Pam Cressey, for sharing her valuable time and wonderful insights with us. And like I said, this is only part one, but we'd love to get your feedback on today's program and ideas for future programs. In the chat box, you'll see a link to a survey that Amber is going to be putting on there. Please click on the link and take a few moments to share your feedback with us. We'll also send this link in a follow-up email later today. So we hope to see you next week. And write that down, Tuesday, 10 August, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the second part of today's Tuesday Explorers. So Pam Cressey will be back next week to finish the story. There is a link to RSVP for it in the chat box. And until then, stay curious and keep exploring. Alexandria is a great place to visit. My wife and I always go there and do, of course, get exercise, but also learn so much about the history of Alexandria that Pam has so eloquently put out today. So thank you folks for joining us today. Stay safe out there. And like we said, keep on exploring. Take care.
Bye-bye.